Hello, I'm Dick Campbell from Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Welcome to another one of my Great Moments in History presentations. Since 1999, I've now created a variety of 12 history stories. And now I'd like to share one of these stories with you entitled Remembering Pearl Harbor, starting with this quote from 75 years ago. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. With this opening sentence, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, appearing before a joint session of Congress on December 8, terms the attack by Japan upon Hawaii as dastardly and unprovoked, and asks for an immediate declaration of war. He closed his text remarks with this sentence: "With confidence in the armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us, God." Roosevelt had spoken for only 6½ minutes. In American mythology, Pearl Harbor still represents, even after 75 years, a classical moment of treachery and betrayal. Certainly, it was a moment of historic surprise, and a moment when the impossible happened, when warfare suddenly spread for the first and only time in history to virtually the whole world. The surprise when it first exploded over Pearl Harbor was shattering, and anyone now over 82 years old can still remember what was going on when the news erupted that quiet Sunday. My remembrance of that day was recorded in this December 2007 issue of the History Channel magazine, shown here on page 40 of my published answer to their question, "Where were you on Infamy's Day?" I was 9 years old and living in Indianapolis, Indiana. I had no idea where Pearl Harbor was at the time, but I became very interested in following the progress of our involvement in World War II through radio reports and news coverage in our 3 Indianapolis newspapers. On December 8, 1941, I began clipping anything pertaining to the war for the next 4 years, and by September 2, 1945, I had compiled 8 scrapbooks, which I still have today. I like to refer to them as World War II through the eyes of a Hoosier boy. Looking back after 75 years, it's difficult to imagine how so many clues were missed or ignored, and also somewhat difficult to understand why Japan attacked in the first place. The causes of the war were complex. When Japanese troops landed in French Indochina in 1941, President Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in the United States and cut off Japan's critical supplies of oil from the United States. To Japanese leaders, his actions threatened the very survival of their nation, which they believed depended upon further expansion into Southeast Asia. The Japanese military set its sight on British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines, a U.S. Commonwealth. Without abundant new supplies of tin, rubber, oil, and other resources found in these countries, Japan feared it could not fulfill its destiny to rule Asia. War now appeared inevitable between Japan and the U.S. For years, the U.S. ambassador to Tokyo, Joseph C. Grew, had warned of the temper of the Japanese military. Yet the daring plan to bomb Pearl Harbor came not from a young warrior itching to fight, but rather from a 57-year-old Japanese veteran in January 1941, who was deeply opposed to war with America at that time, Admiral Ishiroko Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University in 1919, and he served as naval attaché in Washington, D.C. from 1926 to 1928. And having witnessed America's industrial strength and vast resources, he doubted Japan's chances for ultimate victory. Although initially opposed to war with the United States, he resigned himself to war under pressure from the Army-ruled Japanese government and its expansionist plans. The purpose of the attack was to sink or cripple large units of the U.S. Pacific Fleet so that they would not interfere with Japan's southern thrust towards the Philippines, and especially the East Indies, with its strategic supplies of oil, rubber, and other resources. Denied oil by the United States, Japan needed an alternate source for her undeclared war with China. Once Yamamoto was convinced that war was unavoidable, he reached a startling conclusion. Instead of waiting for U.S. ships to venture close to Japanese waters, where the Japanese Navy could fight a defensive battle, Japan should launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor to deliver an early knockout punch. If Japan could destroy the U.S. fleet in one preemptive strike, it could set up an impenetrable line of defense across the Pacific Ocean before America could replenish our warship supply. By then, it would be too late for the U.S. to challenge Japan's conquest of Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. Even as the Japanese prepared for war, however, American leaders seemed blind to the approaching danger, suffering from what one Pearl Harbor veteran described as, quote, the supreme overconfidence of a great athlete, unquote. The island of Oahu, due to its fortifications, its garrison, and its physical characteristics at Pearl Harbor, was believed to be the strongest fortress in the world. One U.S. senator boasted that the U.S. Navy, quote, can defeat the Japanese Navy any place at any time, unquote. Even President Roosevelt and his top advisors, who were reading Tokyo's secret diplomatic messages, failed to recognize the imminent danger to Hawaii. The two officers most responsible for defending Pearl Harbor were caught equally unprepared for the assault. The Commander-in-Chief in the U.S. of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Husband E. Campbell, was convinced that Japan would strike in Southeast Asia, not Hawaii. Even after an urgent war warning message to Pacific bases from Washington on November 27, 1941, stating that an aggressive move by Japan is expected within the next few days, Campbell took no special precautions at Pearl Harbor. No ships were sent out to sea, no long-range patrols ordered for Navy scout planes. The commander of the Army's Hawaiian Department, Lieutenant General Walter C. Short, was more worried about sabotage by Hawaii's 160,000 residents of Japanese ancestry than about a surprise attack by Japan. When Short read the war warning message on November 27, he ordered an alert calling for a defense against sabotage, espionage, and subversive activities. Instead of taking measures to ensure that his warplanes could respond swiftly to an attack, he ordered ammunition to be locked up to prevent theft by locals, and his aircraft parked in tight groups out in the open, where they could be easily protected from saboteurs. As a result, they were lined up like sitting ducks when the Japanese bombers swooped in. To be fair, Hawaii's military leaders might have defended Pearl Harbor better if America's intelligence agencies had been more alert and had passed along crucial information sooner. Only a few weeks after Yamamoto began discussing Operation Hawaii with other Japanese naval officers, Ambassador Grew picked up an alarming rumor in Tokyo that the Japanese military forces planned, in the event of trouble with the United States, to attempt a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The Division of Naval Intelligence placed no credence on these rumors and said, quote, "No move against Pearl Harbor appeared imminent or planned for in the foreseeable future," unquote. The rumor was forgotten. Although the U.S. had broken the codes for Japanese diplomatic messages in the summer of 1940, Admiral Kimmel and General Short were not getting information they needed. Among the documents flooding cryptographers in Washington were cables from 29-year-old Takeo Yoshikawa, a spy in the Japanese consulate in Hawaii. Yoshikawa had regularly posed as a tourist in a bright aloha shirt, taking commercial sightseeing trips above Oahu and Pearl Harbor, and then reporting back to Tokyo the number and types of warships in Pearl Harbor. As December 7 approached, Yoshikawa's handlers in Tokyo stepped up their questions to him about the harbor. How long did the U.S. warships remain in the harbor? On what day of the week would there be the most ships in the harbor? Do the battleships have torpedo nets? Were there any observation balloons over Pearl Harbor? Because Yoshikawa was never identified as a spy, his reports were ignored by intelligence experts in Washington. In his next-to-last cable to Japan on December 6, he concluded with this message, quote, "I imagine that in all probability there is considerable opportunity left to take advantage for surprise attack against these places," unquote. Intercepted by U.S. intelligence like the others from Yoshikawa, this cable was not given priority for decoding. It sat in a pile of unread messages until Monday afternoon, December 8. Yet another chance to sound the alert came at 6:45 a.m. Sunday morning, December 7, when the destroyer Ward spotted and fired upon a midget submarine at 6:53 a.m. near the entrance to the Pearl Harbor Channel. This vessel was one of 5 midget and 30 large submarines then encircling Oahu. Their mission was to spy on the base, torpedo escaping ships, and protect the Japanese carriers. The Ward's captain reported its action to the district watch officer, radioing that, quote, "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine operating in defensive sea area," unquote. But the urgency of that message was lost as the duty officer relayed the report to a second watch officer who was delayed by busy signals in telephoning a third officer, who called Admiral Kimmel at home. Having recently dealt with numerous false alarms relating to submarines in the area, Kimmel reacted skeptically, deciding to, quote, "wait for verification," unquote. And by that time, the Japanese bombers were on their way. Incredibly, the Japanese aircraft were spotted by two U.S. Army radar operators at 7:02 a.m. Sunday morning, December 7, while the planes were still more than 130 miles away. Even that wasn't enough to rouse Pearl Harbor into action. Private Joseph Lockard had been training Private George Elliott on the Opana Mobile Radar Unit above Kahuku Point on Oahu's northern coast when the pair saw an enormous blip on the screen, bigger than any Lockard had ever seen before, probably more than 50 planes. According to General Short's directives, they were supposed to have turned their radio set off at 7 a.m. at the end of their daily 3-hour watch. But the breakfast pickup truck had been late, so the two of them decided to keep the radar unit on. Lockard telephoned the information center at Port Shafter, which passed the message along to Kermit Tyler, a pilot with the 78th Pursuit Squadron, manning the desk temporarily. At 7:20 a.m., Lockard told Tyler that they were continuing to track what appeared to be an unusually large flight racing in from almost due north. Remembering that a flight of B-17 American bombers was due to arrive from California that morning, Tyler told Lockard, quote, "Well, don't worry about it," unquote. 4 words that he regretted for the rest of his life. Elliott and Lockard continued to plot the incoming Japanese planes until 7:40 a.m. Then, contact was lost in the background interference as the planes approached Pearl Harbor. Both men then secured the Opana radar and headed down for breakfast. The bombing began at 7:55 a.m. The Japanese task force, under the command of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo in his flagship the Akagi, had steamed eastward from Hitakapu Bay in the Curlies on November 26, 1941, for its 12-day voyage to Hawaii. The Japanese task force consisted of 6 aircraft carriers with 432 aircraft aboard, 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, 3 submarines, and 7 refueling tankers, for a total of 30 ships. At an average speed of 13 knots, refueling daily, the attack force pursued a course of 3,150 miles from Hitakapu Bay through the empty expanse of the North Pacific, arriving at their takeoff point about 230 miles north of Pearl Harbor on December 6. At 5:50 a.m. on December 7, 1941, Nagumo turned his 6 carriers into the wind and increased their speed to 24 knots. Flight decks tilted more than 10 degrees and the wind whipped ocean spray over them. At 6:10 a.m. on the Akagi, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fushida, leader of the air attack, took off in a Kate bomber with the first wave of Zero fighters, followed by the dive bombers, high-level bombers, and torpedo planes. Within 15 minutes, 183 aircraft are winging south towards Oahu. Another 167 planes will follow in the second wave. Fuchida's aircraft had to fly blind over dense banks of clouds, so they homed in on the Honolulu commercial radio station KGMB. Over his receiver, Fuchida heard soft music, then a weather report, quote, "Partly cloudy over the mountains, cloud base at 3,500 feet, Visibility good, unquote. Fuchida flew on. Here's a good picture of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, with the Ford Island Naval Air Station in the middle and the position of the battleships on its northeast side. The small insert map shows the flight paths of each of the waves during their attacks. When Fuchida arrived over Pearl Harbor, he thought to himself, quote, "What a majestic sight," unquote, as he counted the vessels lined up in battleship row in the dawn's early light. 8 of the 9 battleships in the Pacific Fleet were enjoying a quiet day of rest. A total of 96 ships were in the harbor. Fuchida fired a flare at 7:40 a.m. to start the attack. He then sent the now famous radio message to all Japanese commands in the Pacific, quote, "Tora, Tora, Tora," unquote, meaning tiger, 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 indicating that they had achieved complete surprise. Within minutes, Pearl Harbor was pandemonium. Explosions, screams, tearing steel, the rattle of machine guns, smoke, fire, bugle sounding, the whine of diving planes, and more explosions. With Battleship Row afire, Fuchida's bombers circled over the maze of Pearl Harbor's docks and piers, striking again and again at the cruisers and destroyers and supply ships harbored there. Other Japanese bombers swarmed over Hawaii's military airfields, Hickam, Wheeler, Kanoe, and Iwa, dive bombing and strafing the American planes neatly parked on the runways. They quickly won control of the sky. They wrecked hangars, warehouses, and barracks. Fuchida's surprise attack lasted only about 1/2 an hour. Then, after a short lull, the second wave of 167 more planes roared in at 8:40 a.m. And by this time, the Americans in the harbor were on the alert and firing at anything in sight. Unfortunately, 20 planes from our aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, which was returning to Pearl Harbor from Wake Island, came under heavy American ground fire, and 2 planes were accidentally shot down. In the next 10 slides, you'll see some of the major warship casualties from the 2 Pearl Harbor attacks by the Japanese bombers. Several of these photos are from my 1941-42 scrapbook. The Arizona was a total loss, but today is kept sentimentally in commission and is graced by a memorial to all the war dead of that Sunday morning. One of the classic pictures of the Pearl Harbor attack from left are battleships West Virginia, Tennessee, and Arizona. Smoke blankets bomb-ravaged West Virginia and Tennessee in ruins of Pearl Harbor's Battleship Row. The West Virginia was struck by 2 bombs and 6 torpedoes. 105 seamen lost their lives. The California, struck by 2 torpedoes and 1 bomb, struggles to stay afloat. The ship sank over a period of 3 days because her manholes and ventilation systems were open and pipelines ruptured. The battleship Nevada, only ship of her class to get underway during the attack, deliberately runs aground to avoid the possibility of sinking and blocking the channel entrance. The Oklahoma never had a chance. Within 3 minutes after bombs began exploding on Ford Island, 3 torpedoes blasted huge holes in the ship, and she immediately began listing heavily. 2 more torpedo hits caused her to completely roll over within 15 minutes of the start of the attack. Oklahoma lost 416 officers and men. Japanese bombs made accurate use of the Utah, a 33-year-old target ship, and here she is bottoms up in the harbor as salvage crews make their investigations. This is one of the most remarkable pictures of the war. It depicts the blowing up of the magazine of the USS Shaw, a destroyer. It's shown on fire following direct hits by 3 bombs, one of which severed her bow forward of the bridge. The Downs and Caisson with the battleship Pennsylvania behind the 2 destroyers which received the worst damage are pictured here. In this photo, captured Japanese film shows the burning ships along Battleship Row during the attack. More fortunate for our side were 2 U.S. Army pilots, George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, who on Saturday night had gone from a dance at the Wheeler Officers Club to an all-night poker game. They were still in formal dress at 8 a.m. when they saw the first Japanese planes open fire overhead. Under strafing fire, Taylor's car raced back to their P-40 fighter aircraft at Halewo Field, and taking off, the 2 went looking for Japanese planes and found them over Wheeler Field, where the 2 sleepless lieutenants shot down several planes. Official records credited the 2 with downing 7 Japanese planes, almost 1/4 of all the Japanese losses. The great attack was fairly short. The first bombers returned to their carriers just after 10 a.m., scarcely 2 hours after they descended on Battleship Row. Fuchida lingered to observe and photograph the damage and was the last to return to Nagumo's fleet. It was still only noon. Mitsuo Fuchida and Minoru Genda, pictured here, argued fiercely for renewing the attack. But Admiral Nagumo, who had mistrusted the plan from the start, felt he had accomplished his mission and saw no reason to risk his fleet any further. Back in Japan, Yamamoto strongly disapproved of Nagumo's decision to withdraw, but accepted the tradition that such decisions are left to the combat commander on the scene. In terms of casual destruction, this was one of the most one-sided battles in history. The U.S. lost 2,403 killed, about half of them on the Arizona, shown here, and 1,178 wounded. The Japanese, who had expected to sacrifice as much as 1/3 of their force, lost 55 airmen, 9 crewmen aboard 5 mini-subs, and approximately 65 on 1 sunken submarine, large submarine. The U.S. lost 21 surface warships, sunk or seriously damaged. The Japanese, none. The U.S. lost 169 destroyed and 159 damaged. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft. To Yamamoto and the Imperial Japanese Navy, Operation Hawaii appeared to be a complete success. Through diligent training, innovative weapon designs, bold strategy, and fearless execution, Japan gained the upper hand during the first month of the war. But they also made some big blunders at Pearl Harbor. They failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's Navy Yard, which within months repaired 3 battleships and sent them back to sea. Had our Pearl Harbor installations for repairs been destroyed, our fleet would have been forced back to the west coast of the United States for support. Another item which would have prolonged the war at that time. They failed to blow up the oil storage tanks, brimming with 190 million gallons of fuel. Without that fuel, the U.S. fleet would have had to relocate to the mainland of the U.S. Had our oil supply been destroyed, and considering the tremendous shortage of fuel and petroleum generally in Europe at the time, it would have taken years to reestablish that supply and would have delayed our Pacific War accordingly. They failed to catch the U.S. Pacific Fleet's 3 aircraft carriers in port. The Lexington and Enterprise, pictured here, were at sea, and the Saratoga was undergoing repairs in California. And within 6 months, the carriers struck back, sinking 4 Japanese carriers at the Battle of Midway. Likewise, the Japanese made an even more serious error on December 7 by leaving our submarine base on Quarry Point in the harbor free from attack. As a consequence, no submarines or supporting equipment were damaged, and submarines could proceed immediately to stations in the far western Pacific and start their long campaign of destruction of the Japanese merchant marine, which was a primary factor in the defeat of Japan. The submarines sunk in excess of 75% of Japanese merchant marine shipping during the war. So in spite of the reverses we suffered on December 7, there were some spots on which we could congratulate ourselves on our good luck. There was further cause for rejoicing in the fact that the Japanese had made the attack on our fleet while it was inside Pearl Harbor. Had the fleet been at sea, Admiral Campbell would have certainly have tried to force a battle to bring into play the powerful armament that our battleships carried. However, these ships would have been limited to a maximum speed of about 18 knots, while the Japanese task force had a fleet speed of 22 knots. This difference in speed would have imposed a tremendous disadvantage to the U.S. ships. Furthermore, the Japanese task force that came to Pearl Harbor that day had 6 aircraft carriers, where we had none. Imagine, if you can, what would have happened to our slower battleships in an open sea action with aircraft of 6 carriers working on them, and with our fleet having no air cover at all. Remember that on December 7, the Japanese destroyed all of the aviation strength of the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps on Oahu. Instead of losing some 2,400 men, as we did at Pearl Harbor, we would possibly could have lost by drowning or capture almost 20,000 men, had our fleet been at sea in deep water. And another key point to remember was that the men salvaged from the sunken ships in Pearl Harbor were used to form the nuclei of crews that helped man the new warships that were being constructed in American shipyards in 1942 and 1943. Most important for Japan, Yamamoto had misjudged the United States. Instead of being demoralized by the surprise attack as he had predicted, the American people were enraged. No matter what their political differences were, they were now united in their determination to seek revenge. No longer did President Roosevelt have to persuade the U.S. to join the world at war. When the Japanese bombers struck on that awful Sunday morning, they gave Americans all the reason they needed. The Pearl Harbor story touches all Americans with tales of bravery, treachery, heroism, disaster, and sacrifice. Against a backdrop of sweeping historical forces, ordinary men and women were caught up in extraordinary events. No matter how the story is told, the attack upon Pearl Harbor will always resonate in the hearts of Americans, who will never forget the courage of those who died or the importance of remembering why. Today, the submerged Arizona is the centerpiece of the Pearl Harbor Memorial. If you look closely, you can make out the ghostly shape of the sunken battleship beneath the memorial and a shimmering trail of oil that some say is the tears of the 1,177 crewmen who died here. All but 229, whose bodies were recovered in the days after the attack, remain entombed in the ship. As a point of interest, there were 36 sets of brothers and one father-son team on board the Arizona, of which 24 sets died during the ship's explosion and sinking along with the father and son. Like a bridge spanning the years, the Arizona Memorial has become a place of reconciliation as well as remembrance. Of the 96 U.S. warships in Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941, 21 were sunk or damaged. Of the 9 battleships, all supposedly destroyed at that time, 6 were successfully refloated, salvaged, and returned to active service in 1942, thanks to the preservation of the Navy Yard from Japanese attack. Here's what happened to all of these battleships. In addition to the Arizona, the Utah remains where she was sunk, in the harbor, with 58 men still entombed inside. She was the first ship attacked by Japanese planes and was hit by 2 torpedoes, and within 7 minutes she had capsized. Only 1 man was rescued. A memorial to her was constructed on Ford Island in 1972. The Oklahoma was finally turned over and refloated in 1943, and then stripped of her guns, ammunition, and machinery, and decommissioned in 1944. She then was sold for scrap in 1946, and while being towed to the West Coast, she began taking in water and sank in the Pacific Ocean. The California was completely rebuilt and modernized in 1942 and sailed for the South Pacific, ready for active duty with the U.S. fleet, where she received 7 battle stars for her service during the rest of the war. The West Virginia was refloated and modernized in 1942 and returned to service in 1944. She was the only ship from the Pearl Harbor attack to be present in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, for the signing of the formal Japanese surrender documents. The Tennessee was moved to the Navy Yard in Pearl Harbor for minor repairs and ultimately to the West Coast in 1942 for permanent repairs and major modernization. She then participated in many major battles in the South Pacific and received 10 battle stars. The Pennsylvania received minor damage, and after sailing to San Francisco to complete repairs, was ready for service in March 1942. She was awarded 8 battle stars for her service. The Maryland sustained minimal damage due to her position inboard of the Oklahoma, but she returned to the fleet in February of 1942 and was fully modernized in 1944. The Nevada was refloated and modernized in May of 1942 and rejoined the Pacific Fleet in December of 1942. She then took part in the Aleutian Campaign, the Normandy D-Day landings, the Okinawa Campaign, and closed out her career as a target ship in the Bikini Atoll atomic bomb tests of 1946. And finally, only 2 of the 30 Japanese surface ships of Admiral Yamamoto's Pearl Harbor Task Force survived the fighting in the Pacific War theater. All 6 carriers that delivered their bombers to the Pearl Harbor target area were sunk by the end of the war. 4 of them at Midway. In closing, here's a 1998 picture of the USS Arizona Memorial being joined by the USS Missouri side by side in Pearl Harbor, representing the beginning and ending of the United States in World War II. And here's an historic photo of Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz signing the Japanese surrender document aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, surrounded by many American officers. And now you know the rest of the story. And I thank you for your interest in this great moment in history. Thank you.